I always thought I knew my son inside and out, every corner of his heart, every shadow in his soul. But standing in my kitchen that cold March morning, holding a crumpled receipt that would shatter everything I believed about family, I realized I had been living with a stranger. The worst part? I had helped create him. You know, there are moments in life when you feel so raw, so vulnerable, that you wonder if sharing your story might somehow make the pain less real. But maybe that's exactly why I need to tell you this today. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you'd die for, if you've ever wondered whether your love was being weaponized against you, then what I'm about to share might save you years of heartache. I'm asking you now, before we go any deeper, to hit that like button and subscribe. Not for me, but because somewhere out there, someone else is living this nightmare right now, and they need to know they're not alone. They need to hear that survival is possible. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 72 years old. I live in a modest 2-story house in Queens, New York, the same house where I raised my son David after my husband passed when David was only 12. The walls here hold decades of memories, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, the sound of David's laughter echoing through the hallway. I can still see the pencil marks on the doorframe where I measured his height every year, watching him grow from a grieving boy into a man I thought I could trust with my life. The paint on that doorframe is chipped now, faded from years of sunlight streaming through the window above the stairs. Sometimes I run my fingers over those marks. David at age 13, barely 5 feet tall. David at 16, suddenly towering over me. David at 18, ready to leave for college. His hand reaching up to touch the highest mark himself, grinning at me with pride. "Look how far I've come, Mom," he'd said. I hadn't realized then that he was measuring distance in more ways than one. For the past 15 years, I've worked part-time as a seamstress, my fingers nimble despite the arthritis that's begun to settle in my knuckles. The work isn't glamorous, but it's honest, and it kept food on the table after my husband left us with more debt than inheritance. David always said he'd take care of me one day, that everything I sacrificed would be worth it when he made his fortune in real estate. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. I remember the first time he said those words. He was 24, fresh out of business school, wearing a suit I'd altered for him because he couldn't afford one that fit properly. He'd stood in my living room, adjusting his tie in the mirror above the mantel, and turned to me with such intensity in his eyes. "I'm going to make you proud, Mom. Everything you gave up for me, I'm going to pay it all back tenfold. You'll never have to worry about money again." He'd kissed my cheek, and I'd felt my heart swell with a hope so fierce it hurt. That hope carried me through another decade of mending strangers' clothes, of choosing between heating and groceries in the winter, of watching my friends retire while I threaded needles with increasingly blurred vision. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was sorting through old papers in the attic, preparing to donate boxes of clothes I'd outgrown both physically and emotionally. My hands were dusty, my back aching from bending over cardboard boxes that smelled of mothballs and time. That's when I found it. A manila envelope wedged between 2 photo albums, its contents spilling out like accusations onto the wooden floor. The attic was sweltering despite the March chill outside. I'd been up there for nearly 2 hours, sweating through my cotton shirt, debating whether to keep my wedding dress or finally let it go to someone who might still believe in forever. The dress hung on a wooden hanger, yellowed with age, the lace delicate as spiderwebs. I'd been running my hand over the fabric, lost in memory, when I shifted a box and heard the envelope slide down behind it, hitting the floor with a soft thud that would echo in my mind for weeks to come. Inside were property documents for our family's small investment property in Brooklyn, a modest building my husband and I had purchased 40 years ago with every penny we could scrape together. The building had appreciated over the decades, now worth close to $2 million. It was supposed to be my safety net, my ticket to a comfortable retirement. David had been managing it for the past 5 years, collecting rents, handling repairs. I trusted him completely. I remember the day we bought that building. July 1986. The heat had been oppressive, the kind that makes the city smell like hot garbage and broken dreams. But standing on that sidewalk, my husband's hand in mine, looking up at our future, I'd felt only possibility. We'd toured each apartment, imagining the families who would live there, the lives that would unfold within those walls. "This is for David's education," my husband had said, squeezing my hand. "And for us, when we're old. We'll never have to depend on anyone." The irony of that statement would have destroyed him, but these documents, dated from 8 months ago, told a different story. My name had been removed, erased, as if I had never existed. The building now belonged entirely to David Chen and someone named Jennifer Martinez. I stared at that name, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall. Jennifer Martinez. Who was she? And why was her name where mine should have been? I traced the letters of her name with my finger, as if touching them might reveal her identity through some sort of psychic osmosis. Jennifer Martinez. The name sounded young, confident. I imagined her, probably 30-something, beautiful in the effortless way young women are, her signature flowing across the page with the bold strokes of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. And here was my name, my legal identity, simply gone. Whited out in some lawyer's office while I'd been home hemming someone's bridesmaid dress, humming along to old songs on the radio, blissfully unaware that I was being erased. My phone was in my hand before I could think. I called David, my fingers trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice. It rang 4 times, each ring like a hammer against my chest, before going to voicemail. His voice, smooth and professional. "You've reached David Chen. Please leave a detailed message." I hung up without speaking. What could I say? How do you ask your son why he's stolen your future? I sat there on the attic floor, the phone hot in my palm, and realized I'd never heard that voicemail greeting before. I always reached him directly, or at least I thought I did. How many times had he seen my name on his screen and simply chosen not to answer? How many times had I told myself he was just busy, just in a meeting, just unable to talk right that moment? I'd been so eager to believe in his love that I'd accepted every excuse without question. I tried again an hour later. Again, voicemail, then again. By the 4th attempt, my hands had stopped shaking, replaced by something colder, harder. Anger, yes, but also recognition. This wasn't the first time David had shown me who he really was. I had just been too desperate to see it. Between the 2nd and 3rd call, I'd gone downstairs and made myself tea, my hands going through the familiar motions. Kettle on the stove, tea bag in the cup, honey from the jar David's daughter had decorated for me 3 Christmases ago with painted sunflowers. The normalcy of it all felt obscene. Here I was, performing the rituals of ordinary life, while my entire world crumbled around me. I watched the tea bag steep, the water turning amber, and thought about how easy it is to pollute something pure. Just one small intrusion, and the whole thing changes color. My mind drifted back 7 years, to a warm July evening when David's wife, Patricia, had shown up at my door at midnight, mascara streaking her face, her voice raw from crying. She had discovered David's affair with a colleague, found the receipts and hotel reservations he'd been careless enough to leave in his car. She wanted to leave him, to tell everyone what he'd done. She wanted justice. I can still see her standing in my doorway, silhouetted against the porch light, moths circling her head like a halo of grief. She was wearing a sundress, yellow with white flowers, completely incongruous with the devastation on her face. Her hands were shaking so violently that when I handed her a glass of water, it sloshed over the rim, leaving dark spots on her dress like tears. She apologized for the mess. Even in her anguish, she was apologizing. That should have told me everything I needed to know about how my son treated the women in his life. And I had talked her out of it. I can still hear my own voice, calm and measured, explaining that all marriages go through rough patches, that David was under so much stress at work, that their 2 children needed a stable home. I made her tea, held her hand, and convinced her that forgiveness was the higher path. I told her David would change, that this was just a moment of weakness, that our family was stronger than one mistake. We'd sat at the same kitchen table for hours that night. I'd listened to her pour out her pain, the phone calls David would take in another room, the late nights, at the office, the way he'd stopped really looking at her, stopped touching her except in the perfunctory ways married people do when love has leaked away. She'd found love notes in his car, tucked under the seat. "You make me feel alive again," one had read. Patricia had sobbed as she recounted that line. As if I were the one making him dead. As if 20 years of marriage and 2 children and all the times I supported his dreams were somehow suffocating him. I'd held her hand across the table, this woman who had given my son everything, and I'd told her it would be okay. I'd promised her that David still loved her, that men sometimes got confused, that this other woman meant nothing. I'd watched Patricia's face as she absorbed my words, watched hope war with skepticism, and I'd pushed harder. "Think of Emma and Michael," I'd said, invoking my grandchildren like a shield. "They need their father. They need their family intact." What I didn't tell her was that I was terrified that if she left him, David's career would suffer, that the scandal would ruin his business reputation, that I would lose the son I'd sacrificed everything to raise. So I covered for him. I helped him craft the apology. I even spoke to the other woman myself, a conversation so humiliating I've tried for years to forget it, asking her to please leave my son alone, to let him repair his marriage. That phone call haunts me still. I'd gotten the woman's number from Patricia. She'd found it in David's phone. And I'd dialed it on a Wednesday afternoon, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might be having a heart attack. The woman had answered on the second ring. "Hello?" Young voice, confident. I'd heard music in the background, something upbeat and modern that made me feel ancient. "This is David Chen's mother," I'd said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need you to stop seeing my son." There'd been a pause, then a laugh. Not cruel, exactly, but amused, patronizing. "Does David know you're calling me?" "David knows he's made a mistake," I'd said, gripping the phone tighter. "He has a wife, children, a family that needs him. If his family needed him so much, he wouldn't be with me." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were stating something obvious. "Look, I don't want to be rude, but this is between David and me, and I guess between David and his wife. But it's not really your business." My face had burned with shame and anger. "He is my son. That makes it my business." "He's a grown man," she'd said, not unkindly. "Maybe you should let him make his own choices." The conversation had lasted another 5 minutes, escalating into a tense exchange where I'd pleaded and she'd remained frustratingly unmoved, before she'd finally said, "Fine. I'll think about what you said." She never did. But David ended it anyway, or so he told me. Now I wonder if he'd simply gotten better at hiding things. Patricia had stayed. David had promised to change. And I had believed that my intervention had saved my family. I remember the night David came to thank me. It was a week after Patricia had shown up at my door, a week of tense phone calls and careful conversations. He'd arrived with flowers, peonies, my favorite, which I realize now he'd probably asked Patricia to tell him. And he'd hugged me tight. "Thank you, Mom," he'd whispered into my hair. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for keeping our family together." I'd felt vindicated then, righteous. I'd saved my son's marriage. I'd protected my grandchildren. I was a good mother. What a fool I'd been. Now, standing in my attic with evidence of my son's latest betrayal in my hands, I understood what I had really done. I had taught him that there were no consequences for his actions. That family loyalty meant protecting him at any cost, even if that cost was truth itself. I had shown him that I would always choose his comfort over my own integrity. And he had learned the lesson perfectly. I spent the next 3 hours searching through every document in that attic, my heart sinking deeper with each new discovery. There were bank statements showing withdrawals from accounts I thought we shared, transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. There were emails printed out, David must have forgotten these copies existed, discussing the property transfer with a lawyer, strategizing about the best way to transition ownership without my knowledge. One email, dated 6 months ago, made my stomach turn. Mother won't understand the business implications. Better to present her with a fait accompli after everything is finalized. I read that email 3 times, each word carving itself into my memory. Mother won't understand the business implications. As if I were simple. As if 40 years of managing a household budget, of stretching dollars until they screamed, of making financial decisions that meant the difference between David having school supplies or going without. As if all of that had taught me nothing about business. As if the building itself, purchased with my money as much as my husband's, was some abstract concept I couldn't grasp. There were other emails in the pile. One exchange with Jennifer Martinez herself, discussing renovation plans for the building, debating whether to convert one unit into a high-end rental or sell it as a condo. They wrote to each other with an easy familiarity that made my chest tight. Inside jokes. Casual references to shared meals, shared experiences. Like you said over dinner Tuesday, one of David's emails began. How many Tuesday dinners had there been? How long had this woman been part of my son's life while I remained ignorant? Another email, from David's lawyer, outlined the legal strategy in stark terms. Given your mother's age and the complexity of property law, it's unlikely she'll pursue legal action even if she discovers the transfer. The costs would be prohibitive for someone on her income, and family considerations will likely prevent her from seeking recourse. I felt physically sick reading that. He'd calculated my poverty and my love, weighed them against each other, and bet on both to keep me silent. A fait accompli. As if I were some obstacle to be managed rather than a mother who had given him everything. The weight of it all pressed down on me until I had to sit on the dusty attic floor, my back against a box of David's childhood toys. I pulled out a worn teddy bear, its fur matted with age, and remembered buying it for his 8th birthday with money I'd saved from skipping lunches. He had slept with that bear every night for years, clutching it tight whenever he had nightmares about his father's death. The bear smelled like old fabric and dust, but underneath, I swore I could still detect the faint scent of David's childhood, baby shampoo and grass stains and innocence. I held it to my chest and rocked slightly, letting myself feel the full weight of my grief. This teddy bear had cost me $47 in 1962. I remember the exact amount because it had represented nearly a quarter of that month's food budget. But David had wanted it so badly, had pressed his face against the toy store window with such longing that I couldn't bear to disappoint him. I'd bought the bear and served rice and beans for 3 weeks straight, telling David we were having an adventure with our meals. He'd loved that bear. Named it Mr. Fitzgerald, after his favorite teacher. When the bear's arm had torn, David had cried like his heart was breaking, and I'd stayed up all night stitching it back together with tiny, careful stitches, making it stronger than before. I'd told David that Mr. Fitzgerald was fixed now, good as new, better even. He'd hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. "You can fix anything, Mom," he'd said. "You're magic." When had I stopped being magic? When had I become disposable? When had I stopped being the person he turned to when he was scared? When had I become someone to manipulate instead? The sun was setting when I finally made my way downstairs, the documents clutched in my arms like evidence at a crime scene. I didn't call David again. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and began making a list, something I'd always done when life felt overwhelming. But this wasn't a grocery list or a to-do list. This was an inventory of everything I had given up for my son. Item 1. My career. I had been accepted to a nursing program when I was 25, a dream I'd held since high school. But then I got pregnant with David, and my husband insisted one income was enough. After he died, nursing school became impossible. I needed to work immediately, needed to bring in money now, not invest 3 years in education I might never finish. I still have the acceptance letter somewhere in this house. I used to take it out occasionally, in those early years after my husband died, and reread it. Dear Miss Patricia Chen, it began. I'd applied under my maiden name, harboring some secret hope of maintaining a separate identity. We are pleased to offer you admission to our nursing program for the fall 1979 semester. I'd been so proud when that letter arrived. I'd called my mother, practically screaming with joy. I'm going to be a nurse, Mama. I'm going to help people. My mother had been more measured in her excitement. What about the baby? She'd asked. What about your husband? I'd assured her I'd figure it out, that I could manage school and family. But my husband had been firm when I'd shown him the letter that evening. We don't need 2 incomes, he'd said, barely glancing at it. Your job is here, with our son. And I'd acquiesced, folding the letter back into its envelope, tucking my dreams away like a winter coat I'd pull out again someday. Someday never came. Item 2. My mother's necklace. A delicate gold chain with a jade pendant, worth several $1,000s. A family heirloom passed down for 4 generations. I had sold it 10 years ago to pay David's business school tuition when his loans fell through. He had promised to buy it back for me someday. I was still waiting. The necklace had been given to my mother by her mother on her wedding day, and to me on mine. The jade was smooth and cool, a deep green that seemed to glow from within. My mother had held it up to the light before fastening it around my neck. This has protected 4 generations of women, she'd said in Mandarin. It will protect you too. I'd worn it every day of my married life, only removing it to sleep. It had been like a talisman, a connection to all the women who'd come before me. When David's loans fell through, some bureaucratic error he swore wasn't his fault. I'd taken the necklace to 3 different jewelers before finding one who would pay what it was worth. $12,000. I'd held the check in my shaking hands and felt like I was betraying every woman in my lineage. But David had been so distraught, so panicked that his dreams were slipping away. I'll buy it back, Mom, he'd promised, gripping my hands. I swear on my life. The minute I graduate and get a good job, I'll track it down and buy it back. I'd believed him. I'd smiled and told him not to worry. That it was just a necklace, that his future was more important than any heirloom. I've walked past that jewelry store dozens of times over the years, always pausing to look in the window, some irrational part of me hoping to see my necklace there, waiting for me. It never was, of course. Someone else's neck, someone else's history now. Item 3. My social life. For years, my friends had invited me to join their book club, their weekend trips to the Catskills, their pottery classes at the community center. I always said no, always saved my limited time and money for David, for being available whenever he needed me to babysit the grandchildren or help Patricia with household projects. My friend Helen had stopped inviting me to things about 5 years ago. I remember the last invitation clearly. She'd called on a Saturday morning to ask if I wanted to join them for a weekend at a cabin upstate. Just us girls, she'd said, excitement bubbling in her voice. No husbands, no kids, no responsibilities, just wine and terrible movies and staying up too late. It had sounded like heaven. I'd been about to say yes when my phone had beeped with another call. David. Mom, I know this is last minute, but Patricia's mother is sick and we need someone to watch the kids this weekend. Can you help us out? I'd switched back to Helen. I'm sorry, I'd said, hearing the weariness in my own voice. I can't this time. Maybe next year? There'd been a pause. Then Helen had said quietly, Margaret, there isn't going to be a next time. I love you, but I'm tired of being rejected. When you decide you want a life of your own again, call me. She'd hung up before I could respond. I'd meant to call her back, to explain, to make plans. But life had continued its relentless forward motion, and somehow I never did. I saw her occasionally at the grocery store, and we'd exchange pleasant hellos, but the warmth was gone. I'd sacrificed my friendships on the altar of being available, and for what? So I could babysit while David and Patricia went to dinner? So I could be taken for granted and then robbed? Item 4. My home. Not just the property in Brooklyn, but this house too. Last year, David had convinced me to sign a quitclaim deed, transferring partial ownership to him for tax purposes. He had assured me it was just a formality, that it would protect the house from estate taxes when I passed. I had signed without reading it carefully, trusting that my son had my best interests at heart. I remember that day with painful clarity. David had brought the papers over on a Tuesday afternoon, along with lunch from my favorite Chinese restaurant. He'd spread the documents across my kitchen table, pointing to signature lines with his expensive pen. "It's just to make things easier when the time comes," he'd said gently, as if discussing my eventual death was an act of love rather than calculation. "This way, the house won't have to go through probate. You'll still live here as long as you want. Nothing changes for you. It's just a legal formality." I'd hesitated, the pen hovering over the signature line. Some instinct had made me pause. "Should I have a lawyer look at this?" I'd asked. David's face had flickered with something I couldn't identify. Impatience? Annoyance. Before settling back into patient concern. "Mom, that would cost you hundreds of dollars for something that's completely straightforward. But if you don't trust me..." He'd let the sentence hang there, wounded. "Of course I trust you," I'd said immediately, signing my name with a flourish, desperate to erase the hurt from his face. "You're my son. Who else would I trust?" He'd smiled then, relieved, and squeezed my hand. "I'm just trying to take care of you, Mom, like you always took care of me." We'd eaten our lunch, and I'd felt good about being responsible, about planning for the future. Now I wonder how much of this house is even mine anymore. The list went on, line after painful line, until I had filled 3 pages with the evidence of my own erasure. I had spent 50 years making myself smaller, so David could grow larger. And this was my reward: to be cut out of my own life like a cancer that needed removing. Each item on the list was like a small death, a part of myself I'd surrendered believing it was for the greater good. My career, my inheritance, my friendships, my home, my time, my dreams, my identity. I'd handed them over piece by piece, telling myself it was love, it was motherhood, it was duty. I'd been like the proverbial frog in boiling water, never noticing how hot it was getting until I was already cooked. My phone buzzed. Finally, a text from David. "Mom? Sorry I missed your calls. Crazy day at work. Everything okay?" Everything okay. As if he didn't know exactly why I had called. As if those documents didn't exist. I typed and deleted 5 different responses before settling on the simplest. "We need to talk. When can you come over?" The response was immediate. "Swamped this week? Maybe next Sunday?" Next Sunday. 6 days away. 6 days for him to prepare his excuses, to craft his explanations, to figure out how to manipulate me into accepting what he'd done. 6 days for me to lie awake wondering how I had raised a man capable of such calculated cruelty. I stared at that message for a long time. Swamped this week. But not too swamped to text back immediately. Not too swamped to plan his defense. I thought about all the times over the years when David had been swamped. Too busy for Sunday dinner. Too busy to help me with a leaking pipe. Too busy to visit when I'd had the flu. But never too busy to ask for favors. Never too busy to need me to drop everything for his convenience. I set my phone down and looked around my kitchen, really looked at it for the first time in years. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner near the refrigerator. The linoleum was cracked and yellowed with age. The cabinet doors hung slightly crooked. One hinge rusted through. This house, like me, had been neglected, maintained just enough to function but never truly cared for. The refrigerator hummed loudly, a sound I'd grown so accustomed to I barely heard it anymore. But now it seemed deafening, a reminder of all the things I'd learned to ignore, to accept, to normalize. The wallpaper had started peeling 3 years ago, a small corner coming loose. I'd meant to fix it, but David had needed help moving furniture that weekend. And then there was a grandchild's birthday party. And somehow 3 years had passed with me walking past that peeling corner every single day, thinking I should fix that, but never quite finding the time. The crack in the linoleum had appeared after I'd dropped a cast-iron skillet 5 years ago. I'd been cooking for David's birthday dinner, making his favorite pot roast, and my arthritic hands had simply let go. The skillet had hit the floor with a crash that made my ears ring, and when I'd moved it, there was the crack, spiderwebbing out like a broken promise. I'd thought about replacing the floor, but new linoleum was expensive, and David had mentioned needing help with his kids' private school tuition. Everything in this house was like that, broken or breaking, held together with hope and habit. When had I last done something purely for myself? When had I last looked in the mirror and seen someone worth protecting? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me, every creak and groan a reminder of time passing, of opportunities lost. Around 3 a.m, I got up and made chamomile tea, standing at my kitchen window watching the streetlights cast yellow pools on the empty sidewalk. A cat prowled past, pausing to look up at my window before disappearing into the shadows. The cat was gray and scruffy, probably a stray. I'd seen it before, rummaging through trash cans, independent and wary. It never asked anyone for help, never waited by doors hoping to be let in. It simply existed on its own terms, taking what it needed and owing nothing to anyone. There was something admirable in that, something I'd never allowed myself to be. I envied that cat its independence, its refusal to need anyone. My phone buzzed again. Another message from David, sent at 3:15 in the morning. Actually, I can drop by tomorrow after work. Around 7? Tomorrow. Suddenly, the 6-day buffer had collapsed. I should have felt relieved, eager for answers. Instead, I felt a cold dread settling in my chest, because I knew, with a certainty that made my hands shake around my teacup, that tomorrow would change everything. Whatever David told me, whatever excuses he offered, I would have to decide whether to keep sacrificing myself on the altar of family loyalty, or to finally, at 72 years old, choose myself. The dread was physical, a weight in my stomach like I'd swallowed stones. I thought about calling him back, telling him not to come, that I'd made a mistake, that everything was fine. It would be so easy to slide back into the comfortable patterns of denial and enabling. So easy to pretend I'd never seen those documents, never understood what my son had become. I could simply let him continue managing my affairs, stealing my assets, secure in the knowledge that I loved him too much to stop him. But something had shifted. Some essential part of me that had bent and bent and bent for 50 years had finally reached its breaking point. I felt it like a physical snap, something fundamental coming loose inside my chest. I watched the sky slowly lighten from black to deep purple to pale gray, the color of old bruises fading. Somewhere in my neighborhood, a dog began to bark. A car started. Life continued its relentless forward motion, indifferent to my small tragedy. The dawn came slowly, the way it always does in March, reluctant, hesitant, as if unsure whether spring was worth the effort. I watched the streetlight outside my window click off, its job done for another night. A jogger passed by, then a man walking his dog. The newspaper delivery person drove past in their beat-up sedan, tossing papers onto porches with the casual accuracy of long practice. All these people, living their lives, carrying their own sorrows and joys, completely unaware that my world was ending. I thought about my husband then, truly thought about him for the first time in years rather than just holding on to the sanitized memory I'd constructed. He had been a difficult man, controlling with money, dismissive of my opinions. I had told myself it was just his generation, just his way of showing love through providing, rather than emotional connection. But the truth was simpler and harder. He had taught David that women existed to serve, to sacrifice, to disappear when convenient. My husband had never hit me, never shouted. His control was subtler, more insidious. He would sigh when I expressed an opinion that differed from his, would explain patiently, as if to a child, why I was wrong, would make financial decisions without consulting me, then present them as fait accompli. There was that phrase again, as if my input was unnecessary. When I'd wanted to get a job after David started school, my husband had looked genuinely confused. "Why would you need to work?" he'd asked. "I provide for this family." As if providing money was the only way to contribute. As if my labor, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, was somehow not real work. I'd loved him, or I'd thought I did. Now I wonder if what I'd felt was just the relief of being chosen, the validation of being someone's wife. I'd been 22 when we married, young and desperate to escape my parents' cramped apartment, eager to start a life that felt more like the American dream I'd been promised. He'd been 30, established, confident. He'd made me feel safe. I hadn't realized that safety and cage could feel so similar. And I, desperate to honor his memory, desperate to prove I could raise our son alone, had reinforced that lesson every single day for 50 years. When my husband died, people had praised me for carrying on so well, for being so strong. "You're doing amazing," they'd say. "Your husband would be so proud." And I'd felt proud too. Proud that I was maintaining his vision for our family. Proud that David was growing up to be successful and ambitious like his father. I'd never stopped to question whether my husband's vision was worth maintaining. I'd never asked whether David was growing up to be a good man, only whether he was growing up to be a successful one. I'd taught David that women's voices didn't matter by never insisting that mine did. I'd taught him that women existed to serve by serving him without reservation. I taught him that love meant sacrifice by sacrificing everything and calling it love. And now, sitting in my kitchen as dawn broke over Queens, I had to face the reality that my son's cruelty wasn't a deviation from the values I'd instilled in him. It was their perfect expression. The realization was devastating, but it was also, strangely, clarifying. By 6 a.m., I'd made a decision. I called my friend Helen, the one I'd pushed away 5 years ago, my hands trembling as I dialed. The phone rang 4 times and I almost hung up, convinced she wouldn't want to hear from me. But then she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Hello? Helen, it's Margaret. I'm sorry to call so early. I'm sorry for everything. I need help." There was a pause, and I held my breath, preparing for rejection. But then Helen's voice came through, clearer now, concerned. "Margaret? What's wrong?" And I told her. Everything. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam. The documents, the betrayal, the years of enabling, the inventory of everything I'd sacrificed. I cried while I talked, something I never allowed myself to do, and Helen listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage in all the right places. When I finally ran out of words, Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm calling my daughter's friend. She's a lawyer who specializes in elder law. And I'm coming over. Put on some coffee." "Helen, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Helen interrupted firmly. "You're my friend, Margaret. You should have called me 5 years ago. Hell, you should have called me 20 years ago. But you're calling now, and that's what matters. I'll be there in an hour." I hung up feeling lighter than I had in months, maybe years. For the first time since finding those documents, I felt like I wasn't alone. Helen arrived at 7:30, her gray hair still damp from a quick shower, carrying a bag of fresh bagels and a determination that reminded me why we'd been friends in the first place. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd convinced Patricia to stay, the same table where I'd signed away partial ownership of my house, and we made a plan. By noon, I had an appointment with Helen's contact, a lawyer named Susan Friedman who had built her practice around helping elderly clients protect themselves from financial exploitation. Even from family, Helen had said meaningfully, especially from family. By 2 p.m., I'd pulled out every financial document I could find, creating a paper trail of David's deceptions. The evidence was damning: forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, a pattern of manipulation that went back years further than I'd realized. And at 7 p.m., when David knocked on my door, I was ready. He looked good. like he always did. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the smile that had charmed teachers and girlfriends and business partners for 48 years. He held a bouquet of flowers, grocery store roses, and leaned in to kiss my cheek. "Hey, Mom. Sorry about the confusion this week. You know how crazy work gets." I didn't invite him to sit. I stood in my doorway, the documents in my hand, and I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. "I found the papers about the Brooklyn building," I said quietly. "I know what you did." His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, concern, before settling on confusion. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. What papers?" "Don't," I said, and my voice was steady, cold even. "Don't lie to me anymore. I've seen everything. The documents, the emails. I know about Jennifer Martinez. I know you've been stealing from me." David's jaw tightened. "Stealing? Mom, that's a harsh word. I was protecting our assets, making smart business decisions. Without my knowledge, without my consent. You removed my name from property I bought with my own money 40 years ago." "It was for tax purposes," he said, his voice taking on that patient, explanatory tone he'd learned from his father. "You don't understand the complexities of property law, Mom. I was trying to help you." "By erasing me? By planning to present me with a fait accompli so I couldn't object?" His face paled. "You read my emails. Your emails that you left printed out in my attic, yes." We stood there staring at each other, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make me the unreasonable one. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Mom, I'm sorry you found out this way. I was going to tell you, but I knew you'd get emotional about it. The building needed serious renovations, and I had an opportunity to bring in a business partner who could provide capital. Jennifer is an investor. This is just business." "Business," I repeated. "So that's what I am to you now? Just business?" "That's not what I meant." "And this house?" I held up the quitclaim deed. "Was this just business too?" David's expression hardened. "I told you, that was for estate planning. You're not getting any younger, Mom. Someone needs to think about these things." "Someone needs to steal from me, you mean?" "I'm not stealing anything." His voice rose, frustration breaking through the patient facade. "Everything I've done has been to protect our family's assets. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" The word came out as a laugh, bitter and sharp. "You want me to be grateful that you've spent years manipulating me? Grateful that you took advantage of my love for you? Grateful that you've been planning to leave me with nothing?" "You're being dramatic. You'd never be left with nothing. I'd always take care of you." "Like you took care of your wife when you cheated on her? Like you took care of your mother by forging her signature on legal documents?" David took a step back, and I saw something in his face that I'd never seen before when he looked at me. Anger. Real, undisguised anger. "You know what, Mom? I've spent my whole life trying to live up to your expectations. Trying to be successful enough, grateful enough, perfect enough. And it's never been enough for you. You've always held Patricia's affair against me." "I covered for you." The words burst out of me. "I convinced your wife to stay when she should have left. I talked to your mistress. I helped you lie." "And I never asked you to do that," David shouted. "You did that for yourself because you couldn't stand the idea of our family looking bad. Because you couldn't handle the embarrassment." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I felt something inside me crack open. Because he was partially right. I had covered for him partly out of shame, out of desperate desire to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. But that didn't excuse what he'd done, what he was still doing. "You're right," I said quietly. "I made mistakes. I enabled your worst instincts. I taught you that there were no consequences for hurting people. But I'm done now. I've hired a lawyer. I'm fighting this." David's face went through another series of expressions before settling on something I'd never seen there before. Fear. "Mom, don't be rash. Let's talk about this. We're done talking. I want you to leave. This is my house too now. Remember?" The words were cruel, calculated to wound. "Not for long," I said. "My lawyer thinks we have an excellent case for fraud. The quitclaim deed was signed under false pretenses, which makes it voidable. And the property transfer was done without my knowledge or consent, which is textbook financial exploitation of an elderly person. I'm your son." "Yes," I said, and I felt tears prick my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. "You are. And that makes what you've done so much worse." We stared at each other for a long moment, and I could see him warring with himself, trying to decide whether to keep fighting or to try a different tactic. Finally, he reached for me, his voice softening. "Mom, please, don't do this. We're family. We can work this out." I stepped back out of his reach. "No, David, we can't. Because working it out would require you to acknowledge what you've done and to genuinely make amends. And I don't think you're capable of either. So that's it? You're going to destroy our relationship over a business disagreement. You destroyed our relationship when you decided I was someone to exploit rather than someone to love." David's face hardened again, the vulnerability disappearing behind a wall of cold anger. "Fine, if that's how you want it. But don't come crying to me when this gets ugly. Legal battles are expensive, Mom. Can you really afford to fight me?" "I guess we'll find out." He stood there for another moment, and I could see him trying to think of something else to say, some final manipulation that might change my mind. But I held my ground, and eventually he turned and walked away, leaving the roses on my doorstep like a funeral arrangement. I closed the door and locked it, then slid down to sit on the floor, my back against the wood, and finally let myself cry. But these weren't tears of weakness or regret. They were tears of release, of grief for the relationship I'd thought I had, of rage at the years I'd wasted. And underneath it all, the faintest spark of something I hadn't felt in decades. Hope. Helen found me there 20 minutes later. I'd given her a spare key that morning, and she sat down beside me without a word, putting her arm around my shoulders. We sat like that for a long time, watching the light fade through the window. Two old women who'd learned far too late that sometimes love means knowing when to let go. Over the following weeks, I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I'd believed, that I could wake up every morning and choose to fight even when it was terrifying. I learned that I had friends I'd neglected but who showed up for me anyway, bringing casseroles and company and fierce protective loyalty. I learned that lawyers could be kind, that justice might be slow but it wasn't impossible, that financial exploitation of the elderly was taken very seriously by the courts. I also learned that David would fight dirty. He told my grandchildren that I was being unreasonable, turning them against me with carefully curated stories that painted him as the victim. He spread rumors in our community that I was suffering from dementia, that my accusations were the confused ramblings of an old woman losing her grip on reality. He hired an expensive lawyer and threatened to countersue me for defamation. But I'd expected all of that, because I'd raised him, and I knew exactly how he operated when cornered. What I hadn't expected was Patricia. She called me 3 weeks after my confrontation with David, her voice shaking. "Margaret, I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" She arrived an hour later, looking older than I'd ever seen her hands twisting in her lap as we sat in my living room. "He did it again," she said without preamble. "David, another affair. I found out last week. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired. I'm sorry, Patricia. I should have left him 7 years ago when I had the chance. You were wrong, Margaret. You shouldn't have convinced me to stay." The accusation was gentle but firm, and I felt its truth settle over me like a heavy blanket. "You're right. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Patricia looked at me with eyes full of tears. "I'm leaving him this time. I'm taking the kids and filing for divorce, and I need you to testify about the affair 7 years ago, about his pattern of deception. My lawyer says it will help establish character evidence." I didn't hesitate. "I'll do it. He'll hate you for it." "He already hates me." Patricia nodded slowly. "He told me about your lawsuit. He says you're trying to steal from him, that you're bitter and vindictive." She met my eyes. "He's lying, isn't he?" "Yes." "I thought so, because the man he's describing doesn't sound like you at all, but it sounds exactly like him." We sat together for a while longer. Two women who'd loved the same terrible man in different ways, comparing notes on our betrayals, finding solidarity in our shared grief. Before she left, Patricia hugged me tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finally telling me the truth, even if it's 7 years too late." The legal battle took 8 months to resolve. There were depositions and mediation sessions, document reviews and financial audits. Susan Friedman was worth every penny I paid her, which was more than I could really afford, but less than what I stood to lose if I did nothing. She was relentless, methodical, building a case that painted David's actions in stark, undeniable terms. In the end, we settled out of court. David agreed to return full ownership of the Brooklyn building to me, to reverse the quitclaim deed on my house, and to pay my legal fees. He didn't apologize. He didn't even speak to me directly, conducting all communications through his lawyer, his responses terse and cold. I won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The day the settlement was finalized, I stood in my kitchen, in my house, fully mine again, and looked at the peeling wallpaper, the cracked linoleum, all the small signs of neglect. And I decided to fix them. I hired a handyman to replace the kitchen floor. I stripped the old wallpaper myself, spending hours scraping and peeling, finding it oddly therapeutic to remove those layers of the past. I painted the walls a warm yellow, bright and cheerful. I fixed the cabinet hinges. I bought a new refrigerator that ran quietly. I made my house a home again, not for David or for future grandchildren who might visit, but for myself. I also joined Helen's book club, started taking pottery classes at the community center, went on a weekend trip to the Catskills with a group of women my age who made me laugh until my sides hurt. I discovered that at 72, I could still have adventures, still make new friends, still find joy in simple things like sunset hikes and terrible movies and wine drunk from paper cups. I thought about dating, though I haven't worked up the courage yet. But the possibility exists now. The idea that I might share my life with someone who sees me as a partner, rather than a resource to be exploited. Mostly, I've been learning how to be alone without being lonely. How to fill my days with things that bring me pleasure rather than obligation. How to look in the mirror and see someone worth protecting, someone worth fighting for. My grandchildren still don't speak to me. David's poison worked there, at least for now. But I send them birthday cards and Christmas presents, always including a note that says, "I love you. When you're ready to hear my side of the story, I'm here." Maybe they'll reach out someday. Maybe they won't. I've learned I can't control that. What I can control is how I spend the years I have left, and I've decided to spend them on myself, unapologetically, fiercely. I'm renovating one of the apartments in the Brooklyn building to live in eventually. Something modern and bright, with big windows and no memories. I'm taking a photography class. I'm learning to make pottery that's terrible but mine. I'm becoming the woman I never allowed myself to be. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the pull of old habits. The urge to call David, to to apologize, to smooth things over and pretend everything is fine. The maternal instinct to protect him is hard to override, even now. But then I remember standing in my attic, holding those documents, understanding finally that his comfort had always come at the expense of my existence. And I choose myself again. If you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, if you're sacrificing your identity for someone who doesn't value you, if you're being manipulated by someone who claims to love you, I want you to know that it's not too late. It's never too late to choose yourself. Yes, it will be painful. Yes, you might lose people you thought you couldn't live without, but you'll gain something far more valuable: yourself. I'm 72 years old, and I'm just beginning to understand who Margaret Chen actually is, separate from being someone's wife or mother or caretaker. And you know what? I think I'm going to like her. So hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you. Leave a comment telling me about your own journey toward self-discovery, no matter how late it came. And remember, family loyalty should never require your erasure. Love should never cost you your identity. And choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps you write a better ending for yours.